Rebecca Helms sent me a Parasaurolophus, which is sometimes called Parasaurolophus, if you're in a godless Commonwealth country. I can totally take this apart. It's, the first thing that strikes me, it's structured and postured in the old-fashioned, like what you'd see in like Disney's Fantasia, with the semi-aquatic, hunchbacked, gangly-looking thing. Which thing you need to know about hadrosaurs, which is late Cretaceous, rather large herbivores that walked on four legs and ran on two. Ornithopods is the group, because they had feet that looked like bird feet. Which isn't to say they're the only group that had feet that looked like bird feet, but paleontological names don't always make sense. The thing you need to know about them is they were land-based, they were reasonably heavy, and they were pretty well built. They were sturdy creatures. On the subject of paleontological names not making sense, it's called Parasaurolophus or Parasaurolophus. It means near Saurolophus. When they found it, they saw this crest on its head and they decided, oh, this must be closely related to Saurolophus, which is another hadrosaur. Turns out it's closer to like Lambeosaurus and them. So they didn't bother renaming it because it doesn't really matter what it's named as long as it's not the same name as something else. Science. So as far as changes go, for starters, it's tripodal again. And in this case, there's no excuse, toy maker. This could be postured as a quadruped and still be accurate. You didn't need to make it a scaly kangaroo. Kangaroo is an interesting comparison because that's probably the only modern creature that browses on four legs and runs on two, in kangaroo's case hops on two legs that I can think of. So that sort of makes sense. There was, I forget his name, but there was a museum curator that would posture Iguanodon as if it was a wallaby, but he had to break the tail to do it. So tilt the whole animal forward, get the front legs on the ground. The front legs are pretty small, by the way. Both the legs, the haunches and the shoulders should be a little beefier. And when you have it standing in a tripodal pose, it winds up being this hunchback. But if you tilt it forward like it was in life, it's instead this sort of dramatic, straight rectangle for the back, going down into the neck and then back up into the head. And that's pretty cool looking. There's no modern equivalent for that kind of thing. While we're talking about posture, the tail is really rat-like. It's a little too bendy. Also, it's resting on the ground. It would have had its tail out. Even when it was in quadrupedal stance, its tail would have been straight out. I don't remember if it had the reinforcing bony rods that like a theropod would have. We have that in some ornithischians. I don't know if we have it in Parasaurolophus specifically. But if it did, even if it didn't, it had really tall spinal processes on the spine, of course on the spine, on the vertebra, starting about halfway into the back and then over the hip they were really tall and then descending into the tail. So its tail was pretty rigidly straight out and thicker than this. Also, as we tilt the animal forward, you're tilting the hip forward too. The hip stays at a right angle to the back, but the femur should be a little bit projecting forward from it. Basic takeaway, the hip is parallel to the ground, whether it's on four legs or two. The ischium, this is an ornithischian, so the pubis is forward, but the ischium is backward, and you would see that reflected in the look of the tail underneath. It's splay-legged too. The legs are really far apart. They should be under the creature. It's weird that it makes for a very stable toy having them that far apart, but on the subject of the legs, it's digitigrade at least. It's standing on its toes. That's cool. The feet are a little too flat-footed. Like, they should be a little more elephantine. It did have, clear toes and clear claws on those toes, but they were slightly hoof-like, and it definitely had pads under the hind feet and under the front feet. The front feet, incidentally, are lacking their fourth finger, which probably didn't contact the ground. It was a little shorter and a little higher up than the other three, but it had pads. We found some trace fossil of soft tissue, and I always get really excited about trace fossil for some reason. Soft tissue from a hadrosaur. I don't think it was Parasaurolophus specifically, but for a time they thought it was, oh, that's webbing to go between the fingers because it's clearly living in swamps. No, it was a deflated fleshy pad for walking on, and that's pretty cool. So it was, again, terrestrial creature. It almost looks like the feet definitely look like they're supposed to have webbing between them on the toy at least. So that's wrong. Shame. Speaking of soft tissue, the texture of the toy is this sort of wrinkly, leathery look. We know that Parasaurolophus specifically had little uniform round bumps for scales. Because again, we have trace fossils of I don't know why I always get excited about trace fossils. Probably because we so rarely get a glimpse into, the non-bone part of dinosaurs. Slightly tantalizing. And just generally speaking, I mentioned that it's rectangular, but it should be, this is a really emaciated creature. Like, it was lighter than you would think based on the size. It was 30-odd feet long, probably longer. We have partial skeletons of very large specimens of Parasaurolophus, but weight-wise, it would have weighed as much as a small elephant. So give it a little more meat. As far as the neck and head go, they at least have tried to give it an S-curve, but the neck is going into the bottom of the skull when it really should be going into the back of the skull. The head itself is probably pretty accurately sized, but the snout is a little too long. In profile, a hadrosaur skull, and particularly Parasaurolophus, would be sort of a right triangle, and then with the crest projecting backwards. Concerning the crest, maybe a little too straight, honestly. I think this is supposed to be walkeri. There's a few species that we know of for Parasaurolophus. Walkeri had the big, fancy crest, but it should be a little more curved. This is a little too straight. It doesn't look like they've given any appearance for it having a beak on the front of its mouth, and it's kind of important. It had the chewing batteries like any ornithodeuron, but had the beak in the front for snipping. And they've given it eyebrow ridges. I don't know why they always do this. Even in creatures that would not have had eyebrow ridges, they give them just these big, flat, looking expression, probably for that reason. It makes it look more fierce, it makes it look angry. But the crest is really the most prominent structure on the top of the head, not the eyebrows. There's also a skin flap on the back of it. Sure. I don't think we have any evidence for attach points for soft tissues on the bottom of the crest, but we don't have any evidence saying that there wasn't one. And Rebecca Helm specifically requested that I talk about what the crest's function was. She asked if it was used to make sounds, and that's a theory. There are air passages going through the crest of Parasaurolophus and several other hadrosaurs. Some had solid crests, but Parasaurolophus didn't. It had clear passages coming up from the nasal and through the crest. So one of the theories is that it was used for auditory signaling, which is to say it was used for honking. I don't remember where the source is for this, but I'd heard that sound-wise it would sound pretty similar to a trombone, which is cool to me because I play trombone, so I'm making Parasaurolophus noises, except they could probably only make one note. Anyway, secondary, or well, another idea is that it was for visual identification of, this is a mature individual. There's maybe not for Parasaurolophus specifically, but for other hadrosaurs, there was sexual dimorphism which is to say males look different from females. We saw this in Pteranodon also. I might not have mentioned this, but having a big crest on your head is a pretty common Archosaurian solution for, I am sexually mature, please mate with me. So it's not unreasonable to say that that's what its purpose was in Parasaurolophus. Another idea that might be equally valid is there were other hadrosaurs walking around at the time. North America, late Cretaceous, this would have been right around 75 million years ago. Maybe they couldn't immediately tell the difference between one another. We don't know what kind of colors they were and so forth, so we do know that they were visually oriented just based on the evidence around their orbit. Maybe they needed some kind of visual identifier for, hey, that's one of my species, that isn't, because the crest looks different. Which is a cool idea. I hope that covered everything you wanted to know about Parasaurolophus. Thank you for watching Your Dinosaurs Are Wrong. Please remember to like, comment, and subscribe. Even request dinosaurs for me to talk about. Or send me a toy dinosaur like Rebecca did. Our address is in the description. You could go to thegeekgroup.org to find out how to become a member and donate. And we'll see you next time. The point I was trying to make about the animal's name, I made rather badly. What I was trying to say is that if you name a genus such that it's implying the relationship that it has to another animal, you'd better hope that that phylogeny holds up. I should have mentioned that Parks, the original describer, did eventually realize, oh, Parasaurolophus is a Lambeosaurian. It's a completely different branch of the family from Saurolophus. This is hardly the only genus name that has an element that implies a placement it is not in. Megaraptor is not a dromaeosaurid, Aurorajdarco is not an Ishdarchid, Basilosaurus is not even a saurian. If a name is used consistently and remains unique, that's all that matters. And if it has taxonomic ghosts haunting it, that just makes it more interesting to talk about. Like the graphic said, I was trying to think of YDAW there, and the Bernissard iguanodons more generally. I will direct the viewer to our iguanodon episode, because everything we say in there about the baggage that early hadrosaur restorations had was inherited by Parasaurolophus. Lanky kangaroo lizards remained the default well into the latter half of the 20th century. Even though they got meatier over that period, they still retained this meerkat-like posture where, to me, it looks like the upper body is just kind of along for the ride, and the legs and the tail are the main event. In the 1970s and 80s, so post-dinosaur renaissance, we started to see the familiar rhombus shape with the deep chest and padded feet with hoof-like nails, not webbed fingers and toes forming flippers. But a weird thing happened. When the animal was postured as a quadruped, it looked about correct. But then whenever it would rear up, it reverted to a like wallaby Godzilla kind of a stance. And that persisted, I mean, clearly it persisted to the present day in some toys, but that persisted up through the 90s, certainly. I said that they walk on 4 legs and run on 2. I'm gonna take this opportunity to revisit the legs and locomotion, because it might be more plausible the other way around. There's trackway evidence showing a hadrosaurid walking on 2 legs. We can tell that it's walking because the stride is quite short. That has certain advantages at low speed. The animal can see further because its head is higher up, it can reach higher brows, and its entire front of its body has more freedom of movement if it's using its forelimbs to forage. Meanwhile, computer modeling found that 4-legged movement has certain advantages at running speeds, or maybe I should say galloping speeds. It has a higher maximum speed, higher stability, and better cornering because the animal can push off with its front legs. But it does place higher strain on the bones than a bipedal run does. Can the animal's anatomy guide us? A bit. The thigh bone, the femur, has a large 4th trochanter on the back, which Parks, following Dolo, correlated with 2-legged movement. But then if you look at the forelimb,
The upper arm and the shoulder are both very robust, have large muscle attachments, and seem to have been built for load-bearing and probably propulsiveness. They described a juvenile Parasaurolophus in 2013, which didn't have forelimbs, but it did have the impression of where the humerus had been, which implied a pretty scrawny arm on that little animal. And if, as Parasaurolophus grew up, its arm got more strongly curved, developed larger muscle attachments, and became just generally more robust, that would imply that they started out on 2 legs and as they grew, transitioned to 4 legs. It could also mean that the impression we have from that juvenile is incomplete. It's just not showing us the entire bone, and that's why it looks so little. The way the adult's feet supported the animal is worth considering. We know from Corythosaurus and from trackways of Hadrosauropodus that as iguanodonts gave way to hadrosaurs, the feet went from digitigrade to subunguligrade. They were walking more on the tips of their toes. As that happened, the toe pads went from 1 under each knuckle to 1 under each toe. They got more squat and broad and got consolidated. So instead of the toe bone supporting the animal, it was the pad, just like that big kidney bean-shaped pad supports the foot. Consequently, the toe bones got worse at weight support and taking the torsions and stresses of walking around, because they didn't have to anymore. The unguals are squat and flat front to back, which corroborates having hoof-like nails tight to the front of the toe, all of which suggests that compared to a theropod or an iguanodon, these animals didn't have quite the grip or the leverage with their hind feet. The hands or forefeet are in a similar situation. If you just look at the bones, they look pretty dainty, but remember, they had hoof-like nails on the front. The animal's weight was actually being supported by 1 or 2 large pads. From tracks showing a kidney or heart-shaped handprint, and from preserved tissues in other animals, most famously Edmontosaurus, we know that at least fingers 3 and 4, and maybe 2 as well, were encased in this flesh mitt. I will note here that the innermost finger is actually digit number 2. These animals had lost their thumbs. And unlike Edmontosaurus, where the second ungule is longer and more conical and the third ungule is broad and flat, in Parasaurolophus, the first 2 ungules are similar in shape. When the hand is correctly turned submedially, if you squint, it looks like a cloven-hooved ungulate foot. As we mentioned in practically every video, this animal was historically reconstructed with its hands palm back, which it could not do. The type specimen looks like it's doing that, but that's because the elbow was disarticulated after death and the hand and forearm rotated. Their hands were only somewhat turned back, in such a way that because the fingers slightly opposed one another, the second finger, which was the innermost, was essentially parasagittal, was front to back with its joints, which meant that the animal could have some propulsive force there, even though the orientation of its wrist would imply otherwise. All of which is to say, even though these are ornithopods, their feet don't particularly look or work like bird feet anymore. We touched on this in Iguanodon, but the neck of the animal was almost certainly thicker than I portrayed it. I have been unable to figure out how far back beefing up the necks of these animals go, if we're discounting Wilfarth, and for today we are. Lull and Wright in the 40s recognized that the nuchal ligament connecting to the back of the head must be pretty substantial for such an animal, but that observation didn't lead to a particularly thick-necked reconstruction. What Bertozzo and co-authors call a bull neck really originated in the 80s, when Jerkas and then Paul reconstructed that nuchal ligament extending all the way to the withers, to those elongated neural spines over the shoulder, with massive neck musculature running from that to the neck vertebrae. So, like in a horse or a cow, the front of the dorsal spine is encased in the tissues of the neck. Now Bailey, in a paper we've mentioned before, took the ungulate comparison even further. He supposed that these spines that I've been calling the withers were actually supporting a fatty hump. But he also argued that those tall neural spines were trusses supporting a ligamentous suspension system for the head. Not because the head was particularly heavy, but because the animal would be spending a lot of time swinging its head back and forth close to the ground, going after sparse, low, not very nutritious browse. which does square with the environments, at least some of the environments that we find hadrosaurs in. But then you look at his reconstruction, and it has a real thick back and base of the neck that then narrows way down as you get to the head. So that's not the beef neck either. Which is not the only thing from that paper that hasn't aged well, but all of this did move the needle towards a meatier neck. By the early aughts, we saw a more camel-like than horse-like arrangement, which is closer to what I came up with for our original episode. It's certainly an improvement over the swan-like neck, which some workers were still advocating, but then, in 2020, Bertozzo and co-authors took another look at the neural spines of the 7th and 8th dorsal vertebrae, which you can see on this toy, are pathologically deformed into this like saddle shape. They think that what happened was that a heavy object, like a tree, fell across the animal's back, fracturing those spines, and they eventually healed in this V shape with a dished leading edge to the 8th neural spine. And this healing took a month, probably more. And as we saw with Dilophosaurus, when a dinosaur's wound is healing with ligaments pulling on it, weird things can happen. In this case, they got separated into that big V shape. In other words, the injury, whatever it was, happened exactly where the neck ligament supporting the head ended and the ossified tendon lattice supporting the rest of the animal began. 3 spines behind number 8 slant backwards more than we would expect and have swelling in the lower half. Meanwhile, the spine in front of dorsal 7 fused with it, growing this flat, disc-shaped cap, which the authors think is a traumatic ossification of the base of the nuchal ligament. If all this is true, we can make 2 predictions. The nuchal ligament system leaves off wherever the tendon lattice over the hip and the tail begins. And that varies between different hadrosaurs. In Parasaurolophus, it's over the shoulder, over the withers. And 2, we can predict that the neck was deep, depending on how straight the connection was between the 6th or 7th dorsal and the back of the head or the very start of the neck. Depending on how long those fibers forking off of that are, the neck can look more conventional, or it could just be a big triangle. I don't know what I was trying to say there with regard to the angle between the hip and the leg and the tail. I think I was trying to show that the tendon lattice keeps the tail straight, but I don't know why I didn't just bring that up when I talked about straightening the tail otherwise. Throughout the video, I kept saying trace fossils to refer to impressions or really any non-bone preserved element of the animal. There's actually a couple of similar sounding but distinct terms for this kind of thing, and I don't blame my past self for getting confused. Properly, trace means the preservation of something the animal did while it was alive. Most famously, these are footprints, but it could also be stomach contents, or the feeding traces that carnivores leave on bones, or feces, which turn into coprolites, or even the way the animal arranged its nest. It's anything that shows the animal interacting with its environment. So calling skin impressions integumentary traces can be confusing because the only ones that actually fit that strict definition are footprints, which sometimes show the skin texture of the bottom of the foot. Most traces of animal skin were left by animals that had died. But we shouldn't necessarily assume that impressions is the correct term either. Hadrosaur skin is extremely well represented in the fossil record in a few forms. Sometimes the skin leaves a negative mold in the rock as it decomposed, so all we humans recover is either the mold, sometimes called a reverse impression, or the infilled replica, the natural cast. And for many years, if we found fossils with what looked like a 3-dimensional layer that was once the animal's skin, we presumed that those were all natural casts. But some weren't. Some were the actual original skin. These are sometimes called skin casts, which is an unhelpfully similar term to natural cast, but they're not casts at all. They are the original permineralized skin. Sometimes we can even distinguish the layers of the dermis looking at the tissue under a microscope, or we can learn some things about the original chemistry that the animal's integument had in life. Workers in 2020 looked at tissues like these and got the surprising information that hadrosaur skin is pretty thin. It's only like 3 millimeters thick. They mentioned that there's these subcutaneous fibers and layered structures which might account for how such a thin, relative to the animal, membrane preserves so often. All that having been said, as far as those little skin patches that we have found for Parasaurolophus, they seem to have come from the flank. We have never gotten a detailed description of them. We have never gotten good figures of them. As far as I can tell, these are actually impressions. They are not the original permineralized tissues. I just wanted to talk about hadrosaur skin. I didn't have a scale diagram there, so here is one. There are remains of the southern species, Parasaurolophus tubicen and Certicrostatus, suggesting individuals 11 meters long or more. The type of walkeri is more like 7.5 to 8 meters. My notes for this one got eaten by lack of backwards compatibility, which is why I now save my outlines as TXT files. I don't know where I got my estimate for the animal's mass. Credible estimates are as low as 3 tons and as high as 6 tons. The animation I had for the head and neck junction didn't actually illustrate anything. I think I was just really committed to showing things in one layer, if at all possible, even if it meant that it didn't show what I was talking about. But like I said, the ligaments at the neck and head junction could have a couple of possible configurations, but the neck bones do indeed connect to the back of the head. Clearly, I changed my mind about the toy's head being pretty accurately sized between the shoot and the animation. We would re-record that nowadays. Also, I talked about the snout, but I didn't talk about the beak, how the cutting edge juts forward and down in life. Historically, the only way to distinguish species Certicrostatus was its short, strongly curved crest. The problem is, crests come in a lot of different lengths and shapes, so there's always been ambiguity. Are these actually different species, or is this just individual variation, or could it be sexual dimorphism? And then add to this, like other lambeosaurines, we know that the crest changes dramatically in length and shape as the animal grows. In 2013, Fark and co-authors described the aforementioned pretty complete little Parasaurolophus. The lines of arrested growth, or actually the lack of lines of arrested growth, show that the animal was less than a year old when it died. It had not seen its first winter. And some of its bone tissue was still the type that it would have had when it was a hatchling. And yet, it was already 2.5 meters long, which was 1/4 to 1/3 of adult size. But unlike other young hadrosaurs, the skull was already developing a crest, the expansion of the main airway, almost like a bone balloon. They think that Parasaurolophus's crest is paramorphic. That's a different para from Parasaurolophus, at least the way you say it with my accent. I guess if I said it Parasaurolophus, which I think is correct Latin, that would solve the problem, but I'm not going to do that. That prefix means, like, beyond. So if we ever find an anagenetic descendant of Parasaurolophus, we should call it Parasaurolophus, just to mess with people. Anyway, paramorphosis is when a part of an animal starts acquiring its adult form earlier and continues growing for a longer time, which in Parasaurolophus meant that the crest could be way more exaggerated than in other animals. In that juvenile crest, the junction with the nasal is up on top of the head. The whole snout is premaxilla. And like we talked about with Gengosaurus, there was this persistent idea that hadrosaur crests were primarily an expansion of the nasal. And on some level that makes sense. The breathing tubes are called the nasal chambers, so the bones around that would be the nasal bones, right? Parasaurolophus presented particular difficulties, though not as bad as Gengosaurus. The skulls that we have are few in number and tend to be crushed. And even when we can identify the nasal versus the premaxilla, the suture between them is completely obliterated. You can't tell where one bone stops and the other begins. Initially, Parkes thought that the whole top of the snout and the crest was the nasal. The bottom was the frontals, and the premaxilla was just the beak. Later authors disagreed. The high upper part of the crest is certainly the premaxilla. On either side of that are these long wing-like components, where out on the snout, those are clearly processes of the premaxillae, but then are the rear portions along the crest frontals, or nasals, or yet more of the premaxillae? We think nowadays that it was that last one. The bottom of the crest similarly has been considered frontals, or nasals, or both, or even more of the premaxillae. This bit turned out to be largely nasal, but as recently as 2013, we were uncertain how far back that extended. And it wasn't until 2021 that a new skull cleared this up. It was a specimen of Parasaurolophus syrtocristatus in which the nasal leaves off pretty early on the crest. The entire rear bulb of the thing is all premaxilla. This matters because if you're trying to look at the animal's relationships, crest characters are clearly not useful since they vary so much across the animal's life, but non-crest bones are, and now that we know which bones we're looking at, we can actually start using them. The authors did just that and determined that the two species from down south in New Mexico and Utah are closer to each other than either is to Parasaurolophus walkeri from Alberta, which means that the animal's evolution, its ontogeny, and the history of us researching it all involve an expansion of the premaxilla at the expense of the nasal. I misspoke with regard to the teeth. I said ornithoderans when I meant to say ornithopods. Nowadays, I would say that we would catch that, but I still make mistakes like that nowadays. I don't know why I chose to say ornithopods anyway. I could have just said hadrosaurs and been done with it. Just trying to have an example of animals with grinding teeth. There's more I can say about the bones of the eye. In hadrosaurs' ancestors, the connective tissue over the top of the eye socket partially ossified, forming the palpebral, which literally means eyelid, but it's more like an eye roof. Some ornithopods, like iguanodonts, needed more support, so they grew a second bone, connecting the palpebral strut to the back of the eye socket. In hadrosaurs, the entire roof turned to bone and merged with the bones of the top of the skull, so that the only indication they were ever separate are these wrinkled surfaces on the rim of the orbit, and some animals don't even have that. The authors said that they were going to follow this up with finite element analysis, but they haven't yet, at least as far as I can find. Speaking of which, the jaw muscles pass through the bottom of the orbit, so the eyeball must have only taken up a small portion of its socket. It's actually unknown whether species recognition is something animals needed these structures for. Display structures for mate selection is a much simpler explanation, and actually has examples in living animals. But in either case, vision is important. Since we're talking about the eyes, the scleral rings of Corythosaurus and Parasaurolophus correlate with mesopic vision. That is a cathameral activity pattern. It's what we would expect for a large herbivore in a warm climate. It's active during the morning and the evening, but then rests during the heat of the day and the cold of the night. I still do not know where I found that trombone comparison, but looking into it, using wind instruments as an analogy for the function of Parasaurolophus's crest goes back surprisingly far. The original 1931 description of Parasaurolophus tubicin, which is in Swedish, compared the looping airways of the crest to the looping airways in the chest of trumpeter swans, where it resonates with the breastbone, but also to a krumhorn, which appears to be something like an oboe, or maybe a bassoon for the larger one. But Wieman's paper is in Swedish, and I cannot access it, but a review published in Canada the following year makes it seem like he wasn't using these comparisons to say anything about the timbre or tone of the sounds the animal would actually make. It was an analogy for the way that they function. The pipes in the head would vibrate the way that a wind instrument does. The Canadian review actually compares them to a trumpet, which a trombone technically is a form of. In the 80s and 90s, Weishampel quantified a lot of this. He wanted to know what the resonant frequencies of a Parasaurolophus crest were. Since we know the dimensions of the tubes, we can say what pitches a standing wave would be stable at within them. And those pitches do just so happen to be in trombone range. For Parasaurolophus walkeri, at the low end, 48 Hz, and at the high end, 240 Hz. I haven't practiced in a long, long time. For Parasaurolophus syrtocristatus, which I will remind you at the time was only known from smaller specimens, the range was 75 Hz to 375 Hz. One worker, Chiappone, has been working on something he calls a hadrophone, which is one-to-one reconstructing the resonating chamber of these animals. He has a YouTube, but he hasn't posted about this. There's a video on Twitter, but I cannot in good conscience send you there. Suffice to say, it is lower than a trombone. It's like pedal tones or maybe a bass trombone range. It sounds like a movie trailer from the 2010s. I will have more to say about this soon, but the mechanism of vocalization in non-avian dinosaurs is poorly understood. Did they use a larynx, like ours, to vibrate the throat? Did they use a syrinx, like birds did? Did they use both? Did they use some weird thing, like some kind of nasal reed, as has been hypothesized? Workers have made headway on these, but our understanding is still very incomplete. Weishampel approached it from the other direction. He looked at what could the animal hear. Because they had large ears with large tympanic membranes, long, thin eardrum bones, and long, bent cochleae, their hearing range could extend low enough that they could hear the adult wahs, but also as high as 3000 Hz, which according to 2021 research would be necessary to hear the squeaks that their babies were making. So even if the method of sound production is unclear, they had the equipment to listen for it, for what that's worth. But that's probably enough vocalization from me about Parasaurolophus, at least for today. An animal whose fame has completely eclipsed the animal that it was originally named after. And I want to thank you for watching this Your Dinosaurs Are Wrong archive episode. Please remember to like, comment, and subscribe, and we'll see you next time. We would like to extend a special thank you to these individuals who have gone above and beyond to support this show. We could not have done it without you. Thank you.